To set our stage for examining the modern view of the heat of passion doctrine, I want to start with this hypothetical. Assume that upstanding Sally Reporter has a secret from 20 years ago. She appeared in 2 hardcore pornography films. So far, that secret's been buried. That may be a little surprising, given the ability to search for anything on the internet these days, I know. And keeping this secret is important to Sally Reporter, because she's on the short list to host a national morning show. But now, Vic Snoop comes along, he's going to ruin everything. He's discovered the films. He blackmails her. Pay me money or I'm going to release the tapes. Sally thinks, oh my God, bye-bye offer, bye-bye show. Sally's so worried that she succumbs to this pressure. She gives Vic money, thinking that a payment will silence him. But you know that blackmailers don't stop at one payment, so she pays him more. And then she's tapping into her savings to pay him even more. 1 month later, she sees no end in sight. She can't take it. She's outraged. She's losing money. She can't sleep at night. And she remains scared that Vic is going to leak her secret anyway, no matter how much money she gives him. It's funny about blackmail victims. They hardly ever tell their own secret, which would, of course, end the blackmail. And Sally is no different. When she meets him one evening under the guise of giving him more hush money, Sally instead pulls out a gun and kills Vic. We know that in purposeful killings, we start with murder 2. Therefore, the correct issue is, did Sally commit murder 2 when she shot Vic Snoop? Although the other issues noted in the multiple choice question before are all relevant and all good issues, they're not the first issue. In a sense, each of those is really the middle of the movie. Once the crime's identified, that's murder 2, the next statement to make is the definition of murder 2, which we know is the actus reus of homicide and the mens rea of malice, here supplied by the intent to kill that's not justified, not excused, not mitigated. As a reminder, the actus reus of homicide is the same element no matter the criminal homicide charge or the mens rea to be employed. So once you discuss homicide, once you find it, you're done with that element and don't need to keep repeating it as you move through other criminal homicide charges like murder 1 or voluntary manslaughter. So we've got murder 2. The next issue the prosecution will raise is whether this murder 2 charge can be elevated to murder 1 under the theory of premeditation. You're going to look at the planning activities and the motive that Sally Reporter had to determine whether she reflected on killing Vic Snoop. Okay, now we move to our current topic for discussion. Whether Sally Reporter can assert the defense of voluntary manslaughter using the heat of passion doctrine under the traditional view. Remember, we have 5 elements to prove under heat of passion. First, Sally's intent to kill, her subjective state of passion, whether average people would be moved to kill in these circumstances. And here, don't forget, we're discussing only the 5 limited times people might be moved to kill. Then whether there's no reasonable time to cool off, and whether there was a causal connection between the provocation and who was killed. Which of these elements is going to be most difficult for Sally Reporter to prove? The correct answer is that Sally Reporter is going to have the toughest time proving that there was adequate provocation under the traditional view. Let's run through all the elements and see why that's true. First, whether Sally intended to kill Vic. It's weird to say it, but Sally Reporter is going to argue that she did intend to kill Vic. But she's going to say that that intent to kill was only formed because of the provocation she faced. She's going to say that's why the intent to kill shouldn't be murder too. It's not this unadulterated intent to kill without justification, excuse, or mitigation. She's going to argue it was with mitigating circumstances. Next, she's got to show that she was in a heat of passion. This is the subjective test. For this element, we look exclusively at it from the defendant's perspective. Here, Sally's going to point to the fact of her being enraged, her inability to sleep. As I've mentioned before, generally the subjective test, element number 2, is easy to prove. Evidence often shows physical manifestations that defendants enraged, impassioned, inflamed. But pretty funny, one California Supreme Court case actually rejected defendant's claim of manslaughter specifically on this element. That court said that evidence showed defendant himself wasn't enraged. And what was the evidence they used? They used his own interrogation statements against him to prove that point. He said he wasn't enraged, and the court said, you know what, we're going to take you at your word. That element's missing, you don't get manslaughter. The third element requires that the provocation must have been adequate. That means that not only was Sally Reporter in a heat of passion, but so would be the average person. An average person would have been moved to kill when faced with these same circumstances, this blackmailer going after her. This is called the objective test because we look at it from society's perspective, not from the defendant's viewpoint. This is going to be a problem for Sally under the traditional view. For the traditional view of heat of passion, there's only a limited number of reasons that show adequate provocation as a matter of law. Defendant can't meet element number 3 unless the circumstances fit one of these: adultery, mutual combat, extreme assault and battery, injury to a loved one or relative, or resisting unlawful arrest. Those are the only ways under the traditional approach to establish adequate provocation, element number 3. Here, Sally Reporter can't prove this element under the traditional view. There may have been provocation. Blackmailing is actually pretty terrible, and it is a crime. But under the traditional view, it's not sufficient to overcome this hurdle. What she faced is not on the list. It's just that simple. Element number 4 requires that there must have been no reasonable time to cool off between the provocation and the killing. Even under the traditional test, the killing has to be sudden and immediate. Here, Sally can probably prove that the provocation is ongoing when she killed Vic. After all, the blackmail is continuing, so the provocation is continuing. So she probably meets element number 4. At this point, I want to circle back to this idea of what it means to have no reasonable time to cool off. Under a traditional view, we know it has to be sudden. But interestingly, suddenness could take place years later if an event rekindles the passions. So let's suppose X has raped defendant 9 years ago. He goes to prison. Although defendant's been deeply traumatized by this event, by this crime, the traditional view would say that this passage of time of 9 years demands a cooling off. So if the day that X comes out of prison, defendant shoots him dead, I'm not sure she gets this defense because she did have a reasonable time to cool off. But now suppose X comes out of prison, moves into D's neighborhood, and smirks at her when he sees her. Now maybe his act of smirking has rekindled her passions, has inflamed them, as though she were back to that horrible time period. Rekindling emotions can turn stale time period into a sudden killing. The last element is a causal connection. The essence of the heat of passion defense is that defendant killed the one who provoked the defendant. Here that element is met because Sally killed her blackmailer. What this analysis shows is that Sally Reporter loses under the traditional view of voluntary manslaughter. Yeah, 4 of the 5 elements were met. She's got that. But she also needs to prove all 5. And she can't show that the provocation was adequate under the traditional view. That rigidity bothers some courts. Does it bother you when you think about the traditional view? Human nature in a modern world is filled with far more complex emotions than the small list of grievances the law has carried over from the common law. Because of this, there was a movement to alter the traditional view of heat of passion. Courts argue that the defense needs to be broadened to allow defendants to make their arguments, make their case to the jury that they deserve voluntary manslaughter. In jurisdictions that follow the modern view, the elements for voluntary manslaughter are the same 5 elements. That's so important to remember. They're exactly the same elements as under the traditional view, but the difference between traditional courts and modern courts is their interpretation of what constitutes adequate provocation, element number 3, or what it means to have no reasonable time to cool off, element number 4.